Ferrari versus Lamborghini is an ongoing rivalry that runs deeper than many people may realize, and it makes sense that they would be competitive with each other considering all the similarities. They're both iconic brands of luxury Italian sports cars, sometimes labeled supercars, that are headquartered within an hour's drive of each other. They both produce high-quality, high-performance vehicles that are mostly assembled by hand. You have to admit, these are some of the coolest cars on the market. When I was younger, there was a period where I was obsessed with the Lamborghini Diablo, and to this day, whenever I hear either one of these names, I picture a fancy car that is outrageously expensive. The kind of car that you would more likely see on an episode of Cribs than in real life. I'm talking about minimum starting prices above $200,000, with most customers obviously paying considerably more than that. In fact, some of the most expensive cars ever sold at auction are classic Ferraris. Realistically, most of us will probably never be able to afford one of these, and ironically, that is exactly how they want it. These are brands that have been built on the principle of exclusivity. The fact that they are so uncommon and hard to obtain is what makes people want them so bad. Founder Enzo Ferrari famously said that the company's goal was to produce one less car than the market demanded. They're typically wait lists that could be years long sometimes. For certain series, you have to be invited just to have the opportunity to buy it. There's a whole system in place that truly makes it difficult to own one of these cars. As a result, neither company sells all that many of them. In 2023, they both reported record numbers when Ferrari sold 13.6 thousand vehicles and Lamborghini sold 10.1 thousand. Just to add some perspective here, the market leader, Toyota, sold 11.2 million vehicles that year. You have to admit, it is impressive to have such a strong brand while directly impacting such a small percentage of people. So in this video, I want to dig deeper into this rivalry while making 5 key comparisons that I feel are important. First off, I think it's logical to compare the size of these companies. As I already showed, Ferrari typically sells more units than Lamborghini, which I would say is representative of the overall size comparison. Currently, about 5,000 people work for Ferrari, whereas that number is more like 2,000 over at Lamborghini. See, in 2015, a portion of Ferrari was put up for sale on the stock market, where at the time it was valued around $10 billion. Well, the company's market cap has since increased to over $80 billion. Again, a remarkable number for a company that only sells 13,000 vehicles a year. Ferrari has been recognized on various lists as being one of the strongest and most valuable brands in the world. Now, Lamborghini is not publicly traded, so there aren't any figures that are as straightforward, but in 2023, Ferrari's revenue was almost twice as high as Lamborghini's. Taking that into consideration, along with some other factors, suggests that the overall value of the company would likely be higher as well. Though there have been reports from the past that place the two at similar valuations, so they have very much been competitive with each other. Next up, I want to compare the founders, because both companies are named after the person who started it. Enzo Ferrari officially produced the first Ferrari vehicle in 1947, after having already spent years in the racing and auto industries. By the 1960s, Ferrari had already grown into a highly respected ultra-luxury brand that was exclusively driven by wealthy individuals. Much like today, but seemingly even more exclusive, widely recognized, but only producing a few hundred cars a year. On the other end, Lamborghini is named after Ferruccio Lamborghini, who had a much later start in the auto industry because he was first concerned with farming. It goes all the way back to when his parents were farmers, but after World War II, he started buying old war vehicles and repurposing them into tractors. I realize that is not quite the same level of luxury that we have come to associate with the name, but it was a very useful and successful business. Farming was an important part of the country's recovery following the war, and he made a lot of money from it. By the 1960s, Lamborghini himself was one of those wealthy individuals who had bought a Ferrari. The specific details get a little unclear at this point, but the story seems to be that Lamborghini was having trouble with the clutch in that car. After having it replaced by the Ferrari company multiple times, he had his own tractor mechanics take a look at it, where they discovered that it was a common part used in many vehicles, including some of his own tractors. He got really upset by that. The fact that Ferrari was charging so much money for it compared to what he was able to buy it for from his own suppliers, I mean like 100 times more money for it. Well, he ended up confronting Enzo about it, who took offense to the criticism, and things quickly escalated from there. Enzo responded by basically telling him to stick to tractors and let him worry about the sports cars, and that motivated Lamborghini to prove him wrong by starting a competing sports car company. It only took a few years before that company was being praised by critics, bought by celebrities, and to an extent, pulling customers' interest away from Ferrari. Yeah, that is pretty wild, and is going to lead me into my next comparison, struggles. Because even though both companies came out the gate strong, neither one of them was able to maintain it. By the late 1960s, Ferrari was starting to fall apart. There was more competition out there from companies like Lamborghini, some of the new designs were being criticized, and overall they were selling fewer cars. It was looking like Ferrari would need to be acquired by a larger auto company to become more financially stable. For a while, it was really looking like Ford was going to be the new owner, but Ferrari refused to give up any control of their racing segment. That was like Enzo's biggest passion, so the deal never happened. There was a lot of opposition to the deal within the country anyway, having it owned by an American company, so the Italian public was much more approving a few years later when Ferrari was sold to another Italian automaker named Fiat. The idea was originally to buy 50% ownership for $11 million. That was later increased to 90% after Enzo passed away almost 20 years later. Lamborghini, on the other end, started its struggles in the early 1970s, mostly because an oil crisis and a recession are not ideal circumstances for a company that makes cars that aren't exactly known for their fuel efficiency or low price tags. It motivated Ferruccio Lamborghini to sell the company in two separate transactions a couple of years apart, where it went on to file for bankruptcy later in the decade and continued to be sold to different owners. In 1998, it was bought by Volkswagen, where it became part of Audi, and it has made a respectable recovery. Now, it is worth pointing out here that neither one of these supercar brands have been able to survive on their own. In both cases, the founder was almost forced to sell the company, where it has found much more success under the stability and financial backing of someone bigger. Next up on the list is something that stands out to me as being one of the biggest differences between them, and that is their involvement with racing. Without getting too specific here, because it could easily become the topic of the entire video, Ferrari has won everything. For decades, it has won all of the biggest races, to a point where I would argue that Ferrari is probably the biggest name in auto racing. Enzo Ferrari wanted to become a race car driver since he was 10 years old, and throughout its history, a lot of its ups and downs have been connected to it. If you wanted to look up the company on the stock market, the symbol is RACE. Now, for Lamborghini, I would say that it has had shockingly little involvement in racing over the years, considering that it has made some of the fastest commercially produced vehicles. In 1948, Ferruccio Lamborghini was in a race where he crashed into the side of a restaurant, potentially connected to the fact that when he started producing cars 15 years later, he had almost no interest in entering them into races. He also said that he believed it was a waste of time and resources, so he clearly never had that same passion for the sport. In fact, remember, it was all of those clutch replacements that ultimately led to him starting the company, so oddly enough, if he were a better driver, he probably would not have started it. Just think about that for a minute. In the early 1990s, under the ownership of Chrysler at that point, Lamborghini was briefly involved with Formula One racing without much success. I will say that it has become considerably more active in the sport since becoming part of Audi, but still just nothing compared to the long-standing reputation that Ferrari has established. For my final comparison, I want to take a look at what I consider to be each car's most iconic feature. Maybe you could guess what I'm going to say here, but for Ferraris, they have been heavily associated with the color red, specifically a shade of red called Rosso Corsa, which translates to racing red, because like with many things involving Ferrari, it goes right back to racing. A while back, all Italian race cars had to be red. It was a rule from the FIA, but Ferrari has stuck with that color long after the rule has been lifted. There's a famous quote from Enzo saying, "Ask a child to draw a car and certainly he will draw it red." That is a claim that I would like to see tested. Let me know the results if you try it, but it just makes sense. Red is a flashy color that draws people's attention, and that is sort of the point with a sports car. To be clear, you can order a Ferrari in different colors, but red is by far the most popular. I guess in the 1990s, over 80% of their customers requested it in red. Today, that number is much lower, but still pretty high. Now, for Lamborghini, I would say that its most distinguishing feature has to be those doors that lift up. They're technically called scissor doors, but a lot of people just call them Lambo doors. I should be clear that they were first featured on a concept car in 1968, but Lamborghini was the first to feature them on a car that was sold to the public in 1974. Again, they're flashy and draw attention for sure, but they also have practical purposes. Compared to most of the other cars on the road, that model was wider and lower to the ground, so opening the door that way allowed the person to better get out of parking spots without their door hitting the curb or the car next to them. Obviously, there are a million other features and categories that could be compared between these two brands, but these are the ones that stood out to me the most and fit the nature of this channel in that they focus more on the business or marketing of the companies rather than the performance or specs of the cars themselves. Let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on these two companies? Statistically, I realize that most of the people watching this will never own one of these cars, but personally, looking in from the outside, I have to respect what they've been doing. Building some of the most unusual, highest performance, rarest vehicles out there, I get excited just seeing them driving down the road sometimes. And finally, if you are one of the people that has actually bought one of these cars at some point,